Hi, I'm Nell Donato, artist and designer. In my previous video, I shared about my favorite black art supplies. And if you haven't watched that one yet, you can find the link to that video in the description and in the related videos. And if you watched it, you might have seen that I have some examples of white designs over black backgrounds and some cool combinations of black and white. You may be wondering what I use to do that, because I often do that. I often like to work with white over dark colored surfaces, also on dark paper. And white is quite useful also to mix with other colors to get like a whole palette of different shades, whether it's grayscale or chromatic colors. So white is quite a useful color in mixed media art in general. And in today's video, I will share my favorite white art supplies and show you examples of how I use them in my own sketchbooks and mixed media journals. The first tool on my list is a white gel pen. This one is a Uniball Signo with a broad tip, so that's a bit wider. I've also tried the finer tip, but I found that the finer tip sometimes gives an unreliable line. You have to go over the line several times to get a bit more more coverage, but the broad line was pretty consistent. It gave me a nice bright line without having to go over it several times, so that's why I'm kind of sticking with this one. It is great for very fine doodling and writing over dark surfaces. So here's an example of something that I did over black gesso. So it's all done using gel pen, and although the drawing is not much, I'm really pleased with the quality of the lines. And I also have an example here where is it now? So for example, this little doodle over black gesso, that's also done using a gel pen. And I think I've had something like that. So here it's over dark surface, but also over this kind of off-white, the kind of brownish color. It's still the subtle look of white over kind of lighter surfaces is also something that I like. And also these little dots here. So I tend to use white gel pen a lot. It's always in my pencil case, and it's very convenient. So when I'm doing something that's very fine, especially writing, gel pens are excellent for that. So they work over any media that has grit. It's best used over waterproof materials, because sometimes if you use it over watercolor or something else that is water soluble, it's going to mix with the layer underneath. So it's not going to be the bright white. It's going to go a bit gray if you're using it over a water soluble ink, for example. But if you use it over India ink or black gesso or matte acrylic paint, it's going to work quite well. This one that I'm using is not waterproof. I think Gelly Rolls are waterproof, but I haven't had a chance to try them out, so just be careful with that. But also, it's cool that they're not waterproof, because then you can kind of soften the line with a brush, which is what I did on this drawing right here. So here is just gel pen in its original state, just straight out of the pen. But here, these little faint hairs over here are actually, I've first drawn lines with a gel pen, and then I went over them with a wet brush to have this kind of more thinning out effect. So I find that that's also working quite well if I want the details to be more subtle and not so too harsh. Sometimes the harsh details don't really work well. So as you can see, I'm using white gel pens in many different ways, and that's why they are at the top of my list of white art supplies. Not that this list is in any order, but basically I can't live without them, and that's what this is about. What used to be on my favorites list before were paint markers or paint pens. So these are waterproof pens. Uniposca is a popular brand. This is a Pilot Supercolor white in extra fine, so it's a pretty thin tip, which was also nice for drawing and writing. But what's wrong with these pens is, first of all, the felt tip gets worn out and kind of wonky even after very normal use. So I wasn't abusing these pens in any way, and still they were giving me some issues. And also the ink flow kind of clogs up, and I can't use them up even though there's plenty of ink still inside. I just can't do anything with it because the ink flow is not working. It's very spotty. It's very difficult to get them started. So sadly, I had to ditch them for something else. And what I did replace them with is acrylic ink, or sometimes called fluid acrylic. And this is the same one that I've shown in my previous video on black tools. So this is the Amsterdam. I know they have also, Liquitex has some probably golden. I think any acrylic paint brand has some form of this fluid acrylic, and these can be used in many different ways. They can be mixed with mediums, they can be used for airbrushing, they can be used for calligraphy, for drawing, painting. So that's titanium white, an opaque white, and I use this in combination with a variety of pens and brushes. So if I want really fine lines, I have these pens, like the liner pen, which is a drafting pen, and also the calligraphy pen with a flexible tip. There's also the calligraphy tip with a little broader line. And of course, you can also use a brush. You can use them for splatter effects. Now, the problem with using regular paint is that if you want to dilute it, then you lose the opacity of the white. But if you just use this, which is straight up fluid from the beginning, then you can get very, very fine lines and interesting liquid effects, but with its full opaque white instead of the milky white that you get when you kind of dilute regular acrylic paint. So this is an example of a page that I did using fluid acrylic and different kinds of pens. So I think I used these two the most, the flexible pen and this kind of more engineering drawing kind of pen. So all of this, these leaves and the flower doodles and these lines here, it's all made using acrylic ink. And you can see how bright and white and opaque it is, even over black and over red. So that's quite cool. I really like this, and it's become quickly one of my favorite white tools. Now, of course, as I mentioned, acrylic ink is a bit more expensive than other types of ink, but it's waterproof, it's really opaque, and honestly, these aren't cheap either. So I think in the long run, this becomes more cost effective, because the amount of money I spent on paint pens that I ended up having to throw away while they still had ink in them, I think this is a bargain compared to that. But, you know, it might be a bit more expensive to get that bottle at first. Okay, next thing on my list is gouache paint. Very humble tool, usually associated with school, especially elementary school. But I like to use gouache instead of acrylic because it's washable. So when I want white accents that are kind of more spread around a bigger area, so it's not something that I can do with a gel pen, or I don't want to spend so much acrylic ink, then I'm going to use gouache. And here I have an example of some things. For example, this skull detail right here, it's made using gouache. So there's some even some gradients from a more bright to a bit more subdued white. I think this is also gouache, but I'm not entirely positive. And there was a page where I used that. Okay, I used gouache here, but you can't see it because it's mixed with other colors. But here, the white eyeballs are all painted gouache over this background, which are collaged book pages. Now, I use this usually straight from the tube in its most opaque form, but you can also dilute it with water and get kind of gradient effects. It can be reactivated with water. Sometimes you may want that, sometimes you may not. So here I've reactivated with paint, and it kind of blended together in a painterly fashion. But if you want something waterproof, you better use acrylics. Now, the problem with acrylics is if you get it over something like your furniture, then it's going to be really difficult to clean it out. So I usually use gouache when I'm sitting on my couch or when I'm traveling, when I'm somewhere where I really don't want to make a mess and I really don't want to damage someone's property. Then I will rather use gouache, which is very easy to clean, than get acrylic paint all over the stuff and then have to kind of pay damages. Now, yeah, also, when you use gouache, you don't have to be so careful with your brushes, because even when your brushes dry out or if your palette dries out, you can re-wet it and reactivate the paint and even reuse it later. So sometimes I have like a pile of gouache sitting on my palette for days or weeks, and then I just re-wet it again and it activates and I can use it all over again. So it's very easy. If you're kind of want something that is no fuss and you don't have to be so precious about your tools, then I would say that gouache is definitely... Oh, here's some more gouache. Yeah, I forgot to show you this, but also, yeah, all of these very, very opaque elements are made using white gouache. So I'm pretty pleased with that. And like that's really what I use for kind of more detailed paintings and drawings that I use over dark backgrounds. Now, sometimes I want to prime a whole surface or I want to cover something up, and in that case, I will use white gesso. Now, you've probably heard of white gesso. If you're into mixed media, then you probably already have some on hand. If you don't, I think it's a really good investment to have it, because with gesso, you can turn any surface into a painting surface. So basically, you can turn wood, any kind of board, any kind of cardboard, scrap pieces of paper that you have lying around that are not made to make art with, you can actually turn it into a surface to make art on if you put 1 or 2 to 3 layers, depending on how porous the surface is. And you can use it diluted with water in thin layers and then go over it several times, or you can do 1 thick layer and get kind of a textured effect. So I use gesso in many different ways, and typically I will use it either to prime the paper, which is not itself made to be used with acrylic paint. So this is, I'm just going to scratch so you can hear. That's how that feels, a bit scratchy. But also I use gesso to cover up text or to just reuse, recycle other stuff that I have lying around. So here, this is gesso, this is white acrylic. So you can see that this one is a bit more brighter, more whiter. Okay, maybe you don't see that in the video, but I definitely see it in person. So this was just a journal page with some writing on top. And then I went over it with gesso. I could have done more layers if I wanted to hide it, the text completely, but I didn't. I wanted to kind of leave the text poking out a bit, and I made it into an interesting surface that I could kind of draw other stuff on. And you can draw on it with any kind of medium, with colored pencils, with crayons, with markers, with acrylic paint, gouache paint. You can even use some watercolor over it. It's not ideal, but you can. So these are Inktense pencils, kind of like watercolor pencils. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do over gesso. But what I really like about gesso is that it just covers stuff up. So this was a page that had this was actually a placemat that I took from a restaurant, a local restaurant that I frequently eat. And I covered it with gesso and made it into a surface that I could use to kind of make all this stuff on. So this is black gesso and this is white gesso. And you can see that you can literally turn any kind of creative surface into it. And if you don't like something, then you can just repaint it with gesso and reuse it for some other project. So that's why I like it. It's not something necessarily to be used over a dark surface to get details. But if you want to cover up a bigger area, or if you want to make a surface more kind of receptive to the kind of mediums you want to use, then this is definitely a great way to do that. Now this one is maybe a bit coarser than some, but I've heard that there are gessos that are a bit more kind of more smooth. Try out different brands and see which ones you like. I've had this one for ages. I haven't really tried different ones, so I don't know which one to recommend to you, but look around, watch some reviews, and you'll probably find something that you like. Now something that you can also do, I don't use that very often, but you can activate crayons or water-soluble pencil with gesso. Instead of activating them with water, you can mix in some gesso, and then you get a bit of a more pastel-y color and an opaque coverage, a painterly look. So that may be something to look into. I personally haven't tried it yet, but I really would like to, because I think it's gonna make cool looking effects. Now, another thing on my list of favorite white art supplies is a water-soluble crayon. I've also talked about it last time in my video on black tools. So this one is a Neocolor 2 by Caran d'Ache. So there are many different brands that make these. I've tested this one and I've liked it, so I'm not biased to any particular brand. It's just something that I was able to find from brand-wise where I was, traveling or shopping. And so this is very similar to the Woody that I shared last time in my video, a video on black art tools. What I like about Caran d'Ache in particular is that you can buy individual crayons and you don't have to buy the whole set. Usually white crayon is not going to come in the smallest set. You have to buy like a medium-sized set to get white pencils or crayons, and I'm really frustrated by that because white is obviously one of the most useful colors in the kind of art that I do. But a Neocolor you can buy a single piece, and so I don't even have the whole set. I just have a couple of colors that I like the most. They draw on almost anything, even slick surfaces. So let me just see what I can find to show you on a dark surface. Here's one example. So that's, I'm just trying to find the best angle. Okay, that's better. This is a splotch made with red acrylic paint, and I use different kinds of crayons, but mostly the white one to kind of get these highlights in. And you can see that this white is really poking out. It's quite opaque, so I'm really pleased with how opaque these crayons are. Another one example here. So this is on black gesso. There's a bit of metallic watercolor here too, but you can see these white kind of flower stems, and the leaves are also made with this particular crayon. So if you're going to go for something loose, something that does not have to be like super precise, so as opposed to, gel pens or acrylic ink, I'm going to go with some crayons, especially if I want to blend it, if I want to get more subtle gradient effects, which is what I was doing here. And also in the drawing that I've shown you earlier of the dark crystal fan art. So here you can't really see the white per se, but I used white in a lot of these highlights, like here on the top of the beak, and here these textural parts where I've blended them with other colors. And I really like how easy they are to blend, either with the background or with other colors, and you can dilute them with water so you can get very subtle effects. And also you can use them by mixing them with different mediums. So for example, glue or acrylic medium to make them waterproof, because they are water soluble. So that may not be something that you want. But I personally usually use them on top when I'm done with everything else. So I'm not worried about getting into with another type of wet medium after that. Now, the best thing about them is that they work even on plastic, even on glass. They will write over anything. So if you have a gel medium or some kind of a glue that gives off a very plastic film, that it's very hard to work on with anything else except, acrylic paint, well, these do work over that. And I've demonstrated that on a previous video. I'm not going to demonstrate it here because this is not a desk. This is actually just a paper cover on my desk. But usually these are the best for kind of subtle highlights and scribbles, but you can also apply them really thick. Okay, so here I've kind of went a bit thicker and I got a pretty nice opaque coverage. Now, also, I've used these to kind of create splatters. You just take some kind of a brush, you wet the brush, and then you go like, and they create lovely white splatters. If you don't want to use ink over something that you might kind of destroy with acrylic ink, this is going to be very easy to wipe off with just a wet cloth, and it gets off any kind of surface that you accidentally get it on. And it's also very convenient to travel. Unlike bottles and tubes of paint, which may break and just flow paint over your stuff, the worst thing that can happen is it can break. And okay, if it breaks, you can still use it, so it's not a big deal, but it will not damage your stuff if it gets if you break it in transit. So I use it when traveling because it's very, very convenient. Now, you could theoretically write on top of this with other stuff, but I would not recommend it necessarily because it might clog up your pen if you go over it with a marker or something. If you want to write on top of something, I would prefer if you used some waterproof ink or paint, like something else that I've shown here, like gesso or acrylic ink or even acrylic paint. But if you're going to use this on top and not going to go over it with some writing utensil, then you can definitely use this. And the last thing on my list of favorite art tools, white art supplies, is a pastel pencil. And the reason I like pastel pencil is because it is most opaque type of pencil that I can use on media that has a bit more grit to it. So you can use it directly on dark paper. You can use it on black gesso. You can use it on any kind of more coarser surface. I'm not really sure if this is done using this, but I had another page, the one where I've tested all the art supplies. Where is it? Okay, so here, this bright spot right here, and this line, the fine line right here, that's made using pastel pencil. And this one is made using white crayon. I forgot to show you that, but basically you can get quite an opaque line, unlike using colored pencils, which, no matter how opaque they are not as opaque as pastel pencils. And usually I'm going to use pastel pencils along with charcoal or graphite or ink directly on paper. So here in my mixed media journals, I don't have many examples of that, but usually I'm going to use it to add highlights to something where I want, make a bit of more contrast. You can blend it with blending stumps with your finger, and they're nice for kind of gradient effects for soft surfaces. And also, you need to use a fixative with it, because if you go over it with your finger, so for example, I have something here that I made using this pencil. Okay, so here, these white details over red gesso, over red gouache, excuse me, that's made using pastel pencil. And this is also some kind of scrap paper that I painted black. And when I use my finger, it leaves a bit of residue on my finger. So I don't usually spray the insides of my sketchbooks, but if this were on a loose piece of paper, I definitely spray it. But the problem is that when you spray it a bit, the white might get a bit duller. It doesn't have all that that much contrast once you kind of get it wet. So that's something to consider. It's not the most opaque thing of all of that I've mentioned, but it's better in some cases where I want a little more subtle shading, like I wanted to in this drawing. And if you're wondering what this is made with, this is made with crayons. So the white highlights right here are made using the same white crayon that I showed earlier. That's it from my favorite white art tools, and I'd love to hear what yours are. So if you have some favorite white art supply that I haven't shared in this video and you want to share what you love about it and how you use it in your mixed media journals, sketchbooks, paintings, artworks, whatever you do, please feel free to share in the comments. And who knows, maybe there's something that I haven't tried that I might really like. So thank you for your suggestions, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you again in the next one. Bye bye.